Our State of the U.S. segment tonight. The Women's March held their inaugural Women's March convention this weekend, and the theme was inclusivity, ironically enough. Organizers stressed the importance of including women from different backgrounds, though no mention was made of conservative women, pro-life women, gun-owning women, Christian women, or Republican women. You get the idea. But this lack of inclusivity was spearheaded by the organizers, Linda Sarsour, Tamika Mallory, Planned Parenthood, etc. And our next guest asked the attendees of the conference, not the organizers, about the Women's March excluding pro-life women, but only after she'd had a hard time getting into the conference herself. With me now from the Daily Signal, Kelsey Harkness. Kelsey, good to see you.
Thank you, Liz.
All right, Kelsey, this sounds like quite the adventure you were on this weekend. Let's start out with Friday evening. You went to Detroit, you tried to go into the Women's March, and you were not successful.
Yes, so for a week, myself and another producer with the Daily Signal were sending press requests asking what do we need to do to get access and get media credentials to the Women's Convention. They did not respond, and I can't for sure say whether that was on purpose or not. It seemed to kind of be an attempt to deter us from going to the Women's Convention, because I can imagine that a lot of editors, particularly at small media sites, would be hesitant to send their reporters out to a convention that they don't know if they're going to be able to get into. But once we did show up in person, they gave us press credentials, and we had an interesting weekend.
Good, good. I'm glad to hear that you got it. Hopefully the little fuss we made on Twitter helped with that too. Okay, so when you were there, this was very interesting. So 2 points I want to make. First of all, you talked to the women who were at the event, the attendees, and I want to separate the attendees from the organizers of the march. You talked to the attendees about the fact that the Women's March has excluded pro-life women, conservative women, gun-owning women. They actually rejected a pro-life group from sponsoring the original Women's March in January. They said that pro-life women were not welcome to participate in the march. But when you talked to the attendees of the march and told them about this, you got some very interesting answers. I want to show a little bit of this video to our viewers. Take a look.
Did you guys follow from the beginning at the Women's March where pro-life groups tried to sign on as sponsors and they weren't allowed to?
I actually wasn't aware of that, no.
Who was the new wave pro-life feminists? That's true, and they've had a lot of work done since the Women's March. Yeah, but that was definitely something that I highly disagreed with.
It's not a very welcoming space for women who feel conservatively.
After the Women's March was announced last November, I actually Facebook messaged multiple times the co-founder of the march, Bob Land, asking, hey, can Students for Life, we represent the majority of women in this country who are pro-life, majority of our generation are pro-life, can we co-sponsor? And we never got a reply, and then we found out in December Planned Parenthood was like the platinum sponsor.
Do you think that the pro-life women's perspective is reflected in this conference this weekend?
That's a great question. I can't say that it is. I also haven't looked for it. That's also my own personal bias, to be honest.
All right, Kelsey, that was great work, first of all. But to be honest, when I watched this and when you were texting me about this weekend, I was surprised at the divergence here because the founders of the march are so radical. They're so far to the left. They are so exclusive in wanting to reject pro-life women or any women who don't agree with them 100% ideologically. It surprised me that women who attended this convention thought that they should include pro-life women.
Well, Liz, it's interesting because there's a huge disconnect between what you see on stage at the Women's March and what you hear from the leaders and what happens when you actually go there and talk to some of the female attendees in person about what they think, whether this event should be open to women of the conservative perspective. And I also think when you talk to women on the ground there, it's one thing to talk about being pro-life. It's another when you ask, well, what would you say to a female who is pro-life? And then they have a hard time responding to it. And I was surprised, as you were, that a lot of women were actually open to the idea of including conservative women and hearing their perspective in this conference. And they're actually curious to hear my opinion on some of these issues. Whereas I think the leadership of the Women's March and the Women's Convention is not being proactive or even making any attempt to hear women out, conservative women, pro-life women who believe that being pro-life is actually pro-women.
Right, and I mean, that's been my criticism historically since the Women's March. That's been my criticism of Linda Sarsour, is that she claims almost to have a monopoly on women, that if you aren't pro-abortion, then you are anti-woman, and that's simply not the case. But Kelsey, you also found that abortion was a front and center issue at the Women's Convention. Was there any diversity of thought represented?
There's absolutely no diversity of thought on the abortion issue. I was kind of surprised. I guess maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but we have definitely changed from a society being where, abortion is safe, legal, and rare to a society where abortion is celebrated. It is cheered for. Maxine Waters was on stage when she talked about the topic of abortion. All the women in the room stood up on their feet and cheered louder than any other issue that she really talked about. And I think that really raises an important question for us to talk about as a society. Is the act of abortion something that we want to be celebrating, or is it a topic that clearly we're divided on as a society, but we should be addressing more sensitively? It made me draw the conclusion that I imagine a lot of women in that room don't actually know what late-term abortion is, for example, because everyone I spoke with was for it.
Right, and it also shows the disconnect you talked about earlier, because 80% of people in our country, women actually in higher proportions than men, 80% of women, no matter how they identify, Republican, Democrat, pro-abortion, pro-life, they think that late-term abortion should be banned. So there is a disconnect between the leaders. I guess that shouldn't surprise us, since the platinum sponsor, as you pointed out in your video, was Planned Parenthood, the organization that gets $500 million of our tax money every year. Kelsey, last question, because we're almost out of time. This was a part that I thought was quite funny about your experience. You sat in on a panel. It was led by 3 transgender women, and they criticized the Women's March for not including them.
Yes, it's interesting because on the transgender fund, it always seems to be conservatives who are getting the blame for not being inclusive and tolerant. But when I stepped in behind closed doors into their own conversations that they're having within this far left community, it seems that there's a lot of intolerance among themselves, and these transgender women on this panel were really attacking the leaders of the Women's March for not being inclusive enough. So I think it's a little unfair for them to be putting all the blame on conservatives when behind closed doors they're still trying to figure this all out amongst themselves.
It's funny too. The funniest part to me is that they pointed out the pink hat, the pink genitalia hat. That was the symbol that they thought wasn't inclusive, because they said not all women have genitalia that look like that, which just goes to show what we've said all along, that women are more than just our private parts. Kelsey, thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it.